today I am joined by Christine Szpet. We are discussing today estate planning specifically for millennials. Christine and I met actually through my closing transaction of my house, and it turns out that we have a lot in common. So Christine, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your practice?
Absolutely. So I have been practicing law for a little over 8 years now. I started at a very small firm in Bushnell's Basin. And at the beginning of this year, I opened my own practice just outside of the city of Canandaigua called Finger Lakes Attorney PLLC. So I focus my practice on estate planning and long-term care planning, estate administration and probate, and elder law. And as you mentioned, John, I do a little bit of real estate as it relates to all of that. So sales and purchases are pretty common in my practice as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that made me feel really comfortable with you as an attorney when I was dealing with you was the manner in which you explained everything to me and my wife. You made it very clear how the process worked, that there were complexities in the transaction that you made sure to explain and made them incredibly digestible for us. So that helped me to immediately feel comfortable with you. And you've expressed to me that that's kind of part of your practice in general, right?
Yes, thank you. It absolutely is. It is one of the things that's the most important to me, that everyone that I work with feel like they have an understanding of what is going on, that they're not being talked to or at, but rather are part of the conversation. I think that whether it's a real estate transaction where you're purchasing a home and you need to understand what you're agreeing to, or estate planning where you're really thinking about your family and who you would like to take care of, you have to be part of that conversation. And the legal aspects, the nitty gritty of the documents, while everyone seems to really get tripped up with the legalese, I think that if you understand the overarching principle, right, what the intention is, then you've got it. Then we're on the same page. So that's my goal when I meet with any client. We will do a comprehensive process. So, it starts with a discussion, an open-ended discussion about, what is, estate planning, what might you need? And then we go from there.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely perfect. I guess to that point, how would you define estate planning? I'm sure that there are a lot of people that are watching this that might not necessarily know what it is, know if it's appropriate for them. When we think of estate, we think of like estate taxes and wealthy people. But the reason we're doing this is because it kind of applies to everyone, right? So yeah, if you could just elaborate on that. That'd be great.
I think it's such a common misconception that you need wealth in order to have an estate plan. That's actually, something I think most people just tell themselves so that way they don't have to worry about it. The truth is that everyone needs a plan. And half the plan are documents that you actually need during your lifetime. So there is a combined living will and healthcare proxy. That is one of the basic documents. It's intended to cover a situation in which you can't make your own healthcare decisions. And we don't often sit down and talk with anyone, let alone, the people who matter the most, about what you would want in that type of situation. But sometimes the specifics are really important to understand. So that's the first, estate planning document that you use during your lifetime. And then the second, somewhat hand in hand with that healthcare proxy, is a power of attorney. And the power of attorney allows someone to step into your financial shoes. So, imagine the scenario, you're in the hospital, but your mortgage needs to be paid and you don't have anyone else, on that mortgage to authorize as a person to be able to call, to be able to talk to the company. or you need money moved between accounts because it's in one account, but the other account is the one that's auto debited. So a financial power of attorney allows someone to handle those types of transactions for you. So those are the two documents you use during your lifetime. And then the third is your last will and testament. And that is really where, once you've passed, the authority steps in for someone to be able to handle your estate.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a really great breakdown. And I think that it's important for us to really kind of understand that, all of us to really internalize that, and get our hands around it so that we can understand how it's applicable to our situation. And I think that one of the things that people in general, at least in my practice that I've seen, is people in general, especially millennials, kind of tend to avoid talking about or avoid the prospect of putting together an estate plan. And I think that the problem is twofold. One is that that we are emotionally challenged, and then we also don't identify the need for it. What are some of the reasons why you think people avoid kind of setting up an estate plan or coming up with a way to process their estate needs?
Well, I think, that first point that you brought up initially, right, that people basically count themselves out of the running, right? I don't need an estate plan. I don't own anything. But if you own a bank account in your individual name, you own enough to have an estate plan. And I think the second is our culture, right? We have a death-defying culture. And to an extent, I think the pandemic really shed some light on that and brought us in closer awareness of, the proximity, right? That we didn't know whether or not we were going to be affected by COVID and to what extent. And so really helps people to shift their priorities, and maybe even is what's facilitating more of this conversation amongst our own generation. But I think that this idea that, when you're in your 20s or 30s, you're going to live forever. Right. And, the goal is really to be able to live till you're 70 or 80 or 90, whatever it might be for you. And so to think about, well, what would happen if you're not there? How would you be providing for your loved ones? That's really hard to think about because we don't want to think about it. It's easier not to.
Right. Right. And one of the things that you and I spoke about a little bit as well is that people our age, there are some exceptions, I think, but at large, we haven't experienced as much loss as people are who were in older generations, or so I think that in general, when I'm trying to have estate planning conversations with people, there's a lot of that I experienced, that they haven't had to put their parents into nursing homes and create healthcare proxies, and they haven't seen the effects of their parents aging or passing away. So they don't understand the importance of it and how having everything in place can be really important, right?
You're absolutely right. I mean, people are living so much longer than they used to. So the clients that I am seeing who are getting in touch with the reality are in their 50s, or even early 60s. So they're not millennials, right? So they are, several generations above us and really starting to witness, their parents transitioning, and are maybe starting to have the conversation now, right? But oftentimes, again, this is you don't hear about it necessarily from your own parents. In fact, we have to be the drivers of that conversation. And one of the best ways to start that conversation is to go through it yourself. Because when you're sitting in a place of having already put an estate plan in place, it's a lot easier to open the door to the conversation with your mom or your dad about, well, what have you done? Especially because of the cultural norms, we don't talk about money. We don't talk about wealth. We don't talk about our health, and we certainly don't talk about death, but these are such necessary conversations to have. And there is so much that we can do in terms of planning that eliminates the need to even have to deal with this. One of the things that I come across in my practice is, what happens with New York State and the default set of laws that apply. So a lot of times people, assume, okay, well, I don't have an estate plan, so, so there's got to be something in place to, deal with everything. And they're called New York State intestacy laws. Basically, what New York State has done is said, okay, this is the default, right? So if you pass away, then your assets are going to your next of kin. And we've just decided for you who your next of kin are. So it's really interesting. It's worthy of almost like a flow chart in terms of, who your assets would go to. But if you are married with no children, then your spouse would receive 100% of everything. If you are married with children, you would think that your spouse would receive 100% of everything. But in fact, what ends up happening is your spouse only receives the first 50,000 and then 50% of the remainder, and your children receive the other 50%. So this is a really common place for a need for estate planning, is if you are married with minor children, because oftentimes we don't want minor children to just automatically inherit. I've had a few of these clients where they're our age, there's been an unexpected loss in the family, and then I've seen parents having to literally buy out their children's interests so that they can own their home or they can own the vehicle. And that's incredibly stressful, to have to come up with that liquidity just so that their name can be on title to the house that they thought that they would receive anyway.
Right.
So that's challenging with the default set of laws. And then if you are not married and you don't have children, then your next of kin are deemed to be your parents. And that's often a problem too, because parents are dealing with their own estate and long-term care plans. And so what that means from a really practical standpoint, they're planning on eliminating their own assets, passing, what they've earned down to their children. And so we don't actually want money to flow back to parents. It would be much better if it flowed, to example, for siblings, so that it's the same generation, or, closer to, rather, than, going back up to parents. So that's another spot for estate planning. And then, of course, in, millennial lifestyle, there's all kinds of other arrangements, right? So you don't have to be married, but you could have a longtime partner, and, that type of, non-official partnership where there wouldn't be any inheritance rights whatsoever, again, needs an estate plan to really make sure that everything moves to the person that you want it to move to. So just a few scenarios laid out there in terms of the default set of laws. And what I often tell people is, look, if the default set of laws work for you, great. Like you are one of the lucky few who could rely on those default. But for most people, you need an estate plan. And oftentimes it's just even a matter of having the initial conversation to figure out what you need. And so what I offer to all potential new clients is a free initial consultation. I ask that everyone fill out a questionnaire, some paperwork, and then they're welcome to book that initial consultation with me. I'll take a look at everything and then tell you, well, what do you need? And then quote fees from there. So there's no obligation. You can figure out what you need and then make a plan accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that I really like about your approach too, is that it's not only is it very thorough, but it's very upfront and very clear too. And part of the ways that you and I integrate together is that if someone comes to me and kind of gives me the roadmap of their financial plan, I take a look at it, see how their assets are titled, and to your point, we might be able to rely on the default estate plan according to the state, right? We might be able to rely on beneficiary designations or, joint tenant designations. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how you don't necessarily need you might not even need a will, right? To be able to achieve the transfers that you want to achieve in the event that you were to pass away.
It's true. So oftentimes when I sit with people and we look at their plan, what I'm really looking for when you fill out all the financial informations is figuring out how we can eliminate the need for probate. So to take one step back, because this is a really common question, what is probate? So probate is the legal process of proving the validity of your will. So imagine you own all your assets as an individual during your lifetime, and then you've passed away. Well, your assets, until they're transferred somewhere, are still owned by you as an individual. Someone needs legal authority to be able to access those assets. And those documents that were effective during your lifetime, like your healthcare proxy to make decisions for your health, or your power of attorney to make decisions for your finances, those terminate at your death. And that's where then your estate picks up. So there's two names for these types of proceedings. If you die without a will, it's called an estate administration. If you die with a will, it's called an estate probate. And so that's what people often refer to when they talk about probate. They just generally refer to an estate as a probate, but it really actually turns on whether or not you have a will. Now, the legal process for that is generally the same. That, what someone is doing is petitioning the court for authority to handle your assets owned individually by you during your lifetime. So if you own assets jointly, like real estate, you purchase real estate with your spouse, it's titled to both of you, that asset passes automatically to the spouse. There's no deed transfer that's required. There's no estate administration or probate that's required. The title is automatically vested in the other. So meaning, the surviving spouse can sell their home the next month, the next year, no issue. So it's when assets are owned individually, that real estate is owned by one spouse and not the other, maybe because it was purchased before you were married, that's where we then end up needing a plan, not necessarily a will, but a plan for how that asset's to be dealt with. So sometimes what I do for clients is I identify that the real estate's owned by one person individually, and we discuss pros and cons of deeding that property to both individuals. And then that way, title is held jointly and would pass automatically to the other person. So it doesn't necessarily always manifest in a will, although it could, it depends. And that's the whole benefit of, sitting down and looking at what you have, because it's so specific to each person that, to throw the information out there and be like, you need a will. I mean, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And I tend to be a little bit more liberal in moving all the pieces into place to try and eliminate that need for probate. Because in my opinion, if you lose a spouse, you should be grieving. You shouldn't have to be dealing with paperwork. You shouldn't have to be calling an attorney, meeting someone for the first time, and then through this incredibly emotional process, be learning that you don't own your home and you're going to need to buy out your children. And it's going to take 2 years, very stressful information to be digesting at the same time that you're also grieving.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that one of the things that I try to focus on when I'm talking about an estate plan is that I've helped people. You and I are both in the, I guess, unfortunate spot of having to help people through very emotional times when their significant others or their family members pass away. In terms of actually processing the investment accounts and things like that, I've been in the situation where people have a roadmap of things that they need to coordinate, and whether it goes well and is kind of a painless scenario, or if it's kind of a big beast that the person who's in charge of the executor of the estate is in charge of moving the money. It's always a burden. It's just a question of how much of a burden is it, and how much of a burden it is isn't necessarily dependent on how many accounts there are or how complex the situation is. It's really about how organized everything was, right? And that's a big part of, I think, what an estate plan does as well. It's of course it's titling, of course it's making sure that the disposition of the assets at the end of the day will be according to the decedent's wishes, but it's also a matter of organization too. And so when I'm talking to clients about, having your estate in order, it's not just about the actual names on the accounts. It's also about, what would, if you were to pass away tomorrow, what would your spouse do? Or, have you had conversations about where the important documents are? When I was an assistant several years ago, we would have people bring in stock certificates from their parents that they found years and years after they had passed away. And by that time, the estate accounts have already been closed, and it's a whole big nightmare. So organization on top of figuring out how to title things is really important too. But sitting down and having the conversation, because from our point of view, from the investment accounts, obviously, we can do things like joint tenants with rights of survivorship, transfer on death designations for individual accounts. But one of the things that is kind of under talked about is beneficiary designations on retirement accounts. So one of my processes is I focus on making sure that I fully understand the beneficiary designations on each of the retirement accounts. I can't tell you how many clients I've had that I meet with and say, I say, who are your beneficiaries? And they either give me a blank look, or they say, I think it's my spouse, or I think it's my children. And it's like, well, we need to know that for certain, because we can avoid estate issues, especially when it's a retirement account. We want to avoid that money flowing into the estate,
with
right,
the exception of minor children, which I think is one of the biggest talking points that I have had with clients, where, yes, you want your beneficiary designations to name your spouse, you want it to name whomever you want it to go to. But when we talk about minor children, this is where I find new parents, they're like, oh, I put my kids right on my, retirement account, contingent beneficiary designation. And then it triggers the need for a different court proceeding that they had no idea even really existed, called the guardianship. And what ends up happening is, if there is more than $10,000 worth of assets to go to a minor child, now the court that governs estates, the surrogates court, is basically the compter on this account. They're a co-owner with the surviving parent that's a guardian for the benefit of minor children. And the benefit of retirement accounts, oftentimes when we're talking about qualified pre-tax dollars, is that they're able to grow for a period of time. And we saw this huge change in 2020 with the passage of the Secure Act. And, really it's something that won't fully come to a topic of conversation until it impacts the generations with the tax consequences. But what the federal government and the Congress really did was basically change the way that retirement benefits are stretched over children's lifetimes. So for adult children inheriting from a parent's retirement account that was pre-tax dollars, so something that like a 401k that became an IRA, it used to be that we could take a lifetime stretch, which means that that money could continue to grow, and we would have the benefit of having the distributions be able to come out over our entire lifetime. And they capped it at a 10-year stretch. And so now, if we lose a parent and we're the beneficiary of that retirement account, and it was pre-tax dollars, in the course of 10 years, that money needs to come out of that account at our tax brackets. We pay income on that. And when we talk about minor children, this is somewhere where the rubber meets the road. You know, we end up in this situation where parents are naming their minor children. And this is a millennial problem, right? Because this is like our gut instinct, like, yep, I'm going to name them right on the account. And then it triggers that need for a guardianship. And what ends up happening, the court would require that account to be liquidated and then put into a bank account. And then at age 18, that minor child receives everything outright, which was absolutely not the parents' intention. They were intending for it to stay as a retirement account and for it to continue to grow with its tax-free benefits. And so this is where sitting down and having the conversation, putting an estate plan in place really does make sense, because I create testamentary trusts. And these trusts only come into effect if the set of contingencies is met, right? Both parents have passed away, and then there's this need for a trust to hold retirement assets. So a very, very specific set of circumstances that would trigger this trust into existence. But exactly right. So much of our conversation that we have with clients is an educational component, right? And so when the answer is, I don't even know who I've named, that just opens the door for the rest of the conversation for it to really be like, okay, well, starting from there, well, let's get you up to speed. Who did you name? And is that really who you want to have named? And here's maybe pros and cons, you know, of how it would actually play out in a really practical sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're taught this is really important stuff to understand, but it's super technical, right? This is the type of stuff where we need your level of expertise to be able to navigate these types of things. And as a financial planner, I don't practice law. I definitely don't do that. But I can help identify the moments where we are like, okay, well, this is a situation where we need the expertise of someone like Christine to be able to make sure that we're addressing all of your risks, that we're making sure that in the event that something were to happen to both parents, or you know, whatever parent is the primary caretaker, that things are taken care of correctly. So I guess we talked about how that in particular is a primary thing that should be on the radar of millennials, especially as we're starting to grow our families and things along those lines. Are there other particular issues that you think are important for millennials to kind of keep on their radar in terms of estate planning, maybe healthcare proxy, things like that?
Actually, so I think the second most important issue to keep on our radar are our parents. So this is one thing that I think we're going to start to see probably over the course of the next decade really come, you know, more to the table of the conversation, because people are starting to talk more and more about this. But our parents are at a point where, you know, they were doing, you know, their life planning based on the set of rules that was in existence at the time that they were our age, working age, right? So, you know, it was really beneficial for them to fund retirement accounts, right? And then, you know, lo and behold, and just as they're now retired, the rules change, right? And so we are at this point where, you know, because of our awareness around what's changing, we can be the catalyst for that conversation. And so sometimes that might look like, you know, parents moving their assets from, you know, an IRA to a Roth because they're at a lower income tax bracket than we will be when that money passes to us. And these conversations can be really, really difficult to have, but at the same time, as it plays into the bigger picture, which is that, you know, they're aging and also have information that has been very closely held, generally speaking, right? A cultural norm, again, not talking about money, starting to have these conversations about what you're doing in order to start opening the door for the conversation about what they're doing so that you can get a better understanding. Because more likely than not, it's going to be you lose a parent and then you're navigating their situation, and there is the lack of information, right? More so than even unexpectedly losing a spouse. when you're navigating with parents and suddenly you have no idea where they banked, where, you know, they held their finances, how they chose to manage their investments, you know, that can be an incredibly stressful situation to step into. And if you lose one parent and you're just supporting the other parent in terms of navigating that less so of that type of role, but then you start to look at a parent who now has lost their spouse and may start to be showing signs of decline, whether that be because of grief or because of aging. And tuning into that, even though we're at the busiest point in our lives, right, where we're working nonstop, we have families, we have, you know, all sorts of things that are consuming us, that piece is incredibly important because there are things that they can be doing to protect their assets for us and from the cost of long-term care. And so oftentimes it's our generation and even a few generations above us that are helping to facilitate these conversations on behalf of their parents so that they are informed and then can bring that information to them and say, look, you know, here's some more information for you. You know, you should really consider talking to an attorney about doing some long-term care planning. And that's, I think, really the biggest thing that's somewhat not on our radar at all, unless you've already had this experience. And I would say it's pretty uncommon for someone our age to have already experienced a loss, but it's something that's going to continue to come up in the years to come.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely. How, so you touched on something that I think is really important. You said these conversations are difficult, and they definitely are. Have you found that there are, through your practice, better ways than others to approach the conversation, to engage our parents or to engage our loved ones in these types of difficult conversations? Or do you kind of is it kind of not really one consistent approach that works?
I found it's different for every family. Some families, they can't have the conversation at all. They're immediately shut down. And the best that they can do is something like, I think that you should talk to an attorney, and here's what this would look like, right? And then, you know, just passing along contact information, you know, and then sort of like just laying out, like, you know, it's not going to cost you anything to do this, but I think that this is something that you should do. When those individuals come in, I find that it's somewhat of like an eye-opening experience for them. They never imagined any of this information that they just didn't know. And so that then, you know, opens the door for them to then continue to have that conversation with their children, because that's the first thing I tell them. Okay, so we've had this conversation. You're looking at me. I am younger than your children, right? So you can have this conversation with them too. And so, you know, it is interesting to see that happening, and then facilitating those discussions for families. And sometimes it is a joint discussion. I have had people, you know, who have looked at, you know, someone who was in the nursing profession, you know, and was looking at their family and saying, you know, I don't think your home is appropriate. Like, I don't think that you can stay in your home. It has stairs, you know, it's cluttered. There's too much stuff. But the conversation wasn't being heard, right? But when we all sat down and I started, that's almost always where I start the conversation when we're talking about long-term care planning. Is your home sustainable? Or are you living in the 4-bedroom colonial that you raised your children in for the last 35 years? And do you really need to sell and maybe downsize and find a ranch that has 1 level and no stairs and no laundry in the basement for you to carry a basket up and down, right? And then they hear that and they're like, oh, this is what my child was saying, but coming from you, it sounds different. And so, yeah, of course that makes sense. And then they turn around and they're, you know, starting to think about what it's like to sell their home, you know? So it happens in all kinds of different ways, whether it needs to be, you know, something that they take ownership of and then take the lead on, or, children are just kind of facilitating that, bringing them in and saying, okay, yeah, but we need to have a discussion about this. And then, me having that family conversation. And for me, it's such a privilege to sit in on those conversations and to be helping people to think through, what happens when, right? What happens when you're going to need help at home? How do we deal with that? How is it paid for, right? That's not something people talk about, but it's so important.
Yeah, it absolutely is. It's a hard conversation, because then we're asking our parents to look at their own mortality or our elder loved ones, I should say, or our less able loved ones to think about their eventual challenges that they're going to face. And that's an uncomfortable thought for most of us. I'll go out on a limb and say, but I think that it's really vital. And I would say that I think the indicator of care is just approaching it gently. I've found that especially those family members that are just really set in their ways, they play everything very close to the vest. They are the least likely to respond to pressure, right? They are the most unmovable. They're the least willing to kind of think about the consequences, but they might be willing to listen to the emotion. I always, if I'm coming up against a family member that's having a difficult time kind of grappling with this, then I'll ask them, what do you, how do you think that, have you thought about what it's going to be like for us when you aren't here with us anymore? Or have you thought about the challenges that you might face down the road? Or, or even giving someone the permission to think about something like selling a home that they raise their children in, right? Have you thought about selling the house and moving somewhere more comfortable? Or somewhere that you could see yourself for a longer period of time that's a little bit more practical. Just asking questions is a strategy that I try to employ, because it seems a little bit less in any regard, seems a little bit less invasive, I think, than, and it doesn't even need to be pointed. It can even just be like, hey, how have you been? Or, I know that your brother's been getting a little bit sick lately. How does that make you feel? Making it not necessarily about their own decline, but asking them how it makes them feel. Because if someone that I care about, someone who's my age, my contemporary, is starting to decline, it puts into question a lot of my own thoughts about aging, and a lot of my own thoughts about my needs and the needs of my family in the event that I'm no longer here. But I really like that you brought up that it's not just a me and my immediate family question, but also me, and by me I mean the collective, like millennial me. But it's like us and our parents as well, because estate planning it's not just my own thing, it's everyone's thing. And it will, in the way that everything falls into place will have an impact on the people around us, whether we want it to or not.
I think the single most frustrating response that our generation receives when asking the question, like, hey, mom, have you, had a chance to do this yet? And the response is, yes, we're all set. That's it. That is the like quintessential 5-word response. And then our, not wanting to, break those cultural norms is like, okay, great. But then the follow-up to that should be, what do you mean by all set? Right? Like, okay, so like, that's great. If I had to, if I get that phone call, if I had to respond to someone at the hospital, is there a place where everything is kept? Can you show me what you mean by all set? Like, who would I call to talk to? so that you're, gaining more information. And this isn't a conversation you're going to be able to have, one time 15 minutes and then like it's over and done. It is gradual, right? And your example about asking about, what their experience is, right? So like when a parent's sibling, so, you're looking at them and you're like, so that just happened and, so-and-so landed in the hospital. And this is, what decisions were coming up, or this is what the consequence was of that. What would you want in that situation, right? Like, what kind of care would you want in the hospital? Would you want to come back home? Should I need to know, what to do, who to call, how to arrange for that type of care? That starts to open the door. And then, in time, trust that as people have their own experiences too, and we come more in contact with our mortality, right? You have that hospitalization. That's when information starts to flow. That's when people start talking. That's when it's like, oh yeah, so it's really important that and if they're having that conversation and you're the one shutting it down, don't, right? Like, so just so you know, when I go, I really want my diamond rings to go to, so-and-so. Don't shut down that conversation. Have it, listen, receive it, even if it's really difficult for you to imagine what it would be like without your mom or your dad there, to know what they want, to know what's important to them. That is the greatest sign of respect, right? And to say, thank you for sharing that with me, because there is a point in time in which you will need to know. So those are my words of advice on how to have the conversation.
I like that a lot. When you were talking about that, I was reminded of my grandmother before she passed away. She wrote on the back of she wrote a little piece of tape because she had 3 children. She wrote a little piece of tape on the bottom of every piece of furniture, on the back of the grandfather clock, stuff like that, who the item should go to. And even that process, it was when we were cleaning out her house, it was sad for my dad and his siblings, because it was the end of an era, but it removed that conflict. And then it also gave them something to laugh about, like, oh, remember how she would insist that, that Bobby was getting the table and, he didn't want the table, but now we've got to figure out what to do with it. But it made it more lighthearted, as opposed to, everyone kind of clawing at things. When you know what people want and what their wishes are, I think it makes, nothing's going to take the pain away, but it makes the pain a little bit less bitter, I guess I would say. And so there's estate planning isn't just setting up trusts and making sure that your will is in place. It's all of the small things too. Like I said, from organization, like you said, just from having a conversation about, what your wishes are. It's very straightforward. It can be a straightforward process. Would you, I don't know how you feel about this, but would you say that more estate planning is simple or complex?
I would say more estate planning is simple. What I love, my favorite feedback is, oh, that was a lot easier than I thought. I think with most everything, when we don't know, we make it out to be something that's really big. I mean, I do this too. Like, so this is just like a human characteristic, right? Like, you don't know something, or you're anticipating what it might be. And so it ends up being this bigger thing for you to deal with. And so, know that there's a sense of relief, right, that comes along with doing this. And it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much time. With technology, like, I facilitate consults via Zoom, right? Like, if you're, working and you just need me to accommodate the fact that, like, you're not done working till 6, well, great, I'm not done working until long after 6, right? So, like, we can make it work, and it doesn't have to be this, like, really rigid thing, as onerous as, it is to schedule, like even a doctor's appointment is, in my opinion, harder to schedule than, doing your estate planning.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I will say too, I think you have a little bit better connectivity than I do on Zoom, based on some of the challenges that I've run into today. There was a point earlier, my computer decided to take a little nap on me. So thanks for sticking with me and everyone else on the call today too. So I guess, Christine, how can people find you? And do you have any kind of closing thoughts about the topic while we wrap up here? And also, I would encourage people to ask any questions while Christine's wrapping up, that they might have. We have time if there are questions as well. But Christine, go ahead.
Sure. So the easiest way is to just type into my website, flxatty.com. On that site, you'll find the questionnaire that I was talking about. It lists out my practice areas. There's a little arrow. You can literally download the PDF straight to your computer. You want to email it to me, you can click my name. It links to my email. You can email it to me. You want to just fill out the contact form and have someone email you the questionnaire, you can do that too. We get those contact us responses and we respond right away with the questionnaire, and a little bit more about the process, but it's basically what you heard today. And phone number, everything you need is really right there. You can also give us a follow on Facebook, on Instagram. We're posting and sharing so that we can get this information out there. So yeah, that's how you would find us.
Excellent. Yeah, you've been increasing your social media presence, and I've been really happy to see that. I've always, ever since we met, I've been really appreciative of the work that you've done as someone who used your services. I felt great about it. And of course, we are more than happy to help with any financial planning needs that you guys have here at Generation Capital Management. We are very excited to be able to help out wherever we can. Especially, I think that one of our core competencies is having those challenging conversations, bringing people to the table and helping you understand your situation. We have an education first mentality, and Christine, I think that you and I are very similar in that regard. And that's, I think, part of why this is such a good synergy between us. So yeah, I would encourage anyone who has any questions as a follow-up to this. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but if you have any questions that pop up, definitely follow Christine and Finger Lakes Attorney on social media. If check out her website, you can check out our website too, gencapmgmt.com. You can get a hold of us there. And of course, if you found this on social media, then you probably already follow us, but don't hesitate to follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram as well. Christine, I want to thank you so very much for your time and for your patience with my technology snafus. But do you have any other things that you wanted to toss out there?
No, I wanted to thank you for coordinating all of this, and I completely agree 100% about the synergy. And that's the best part, is that anyone who works with you can work with me and vice versa, and we can really have this collaborative approach so all the pieces fall into place. And so yeah. Thank you for having me, letting me share a little bit about what I'm incredibly passionate about, and hopefully everyone found this to be useful for themselves too.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of my favorite parts about being a financial planner, is finding like-minded professionals who do exceptional work. So I'm glad that we were able to do this, and I really appreciate you.
Same. Thank you so much.